Hello and welcome to our first edition of the Education Magazine, a monthly broadcast that will address the topical issues of the day in the education world of children and young people. The aim really is to discuss multiple issues that the mainstream media often fail to give enough time to, frankly. I'm delighted to be joined by special guests today as we tackle what appears to be a mental health crisis in the United Kingdom. But before we get on to that, I must introduce you to some members of the Education Magazine team. My name is Mike Charles, and some of you might already know me. I might have represented you perhaps, or perhaps I've represented your children. Maybe I just know you from Facebook, and that's wonderful because you're very welcome. This privilege has allowed me a unique insight into what has gone wrong in the education world, as well as really what's going wrong now, frankly. I mean, the aim of this Education Magazine is to address these issues and allow the audience a chance to shape the debate and to be informed about things that you really need to know. Charlotte Hadfield is also with me, and you might remember Charlotte from other broadcasts that we've done. Charlotte is a fabulous barrister operating from central London, along with my good friend and colleague, the marvellous Chris McFarland, a solicitor who follows in my footsteps, representing the most vulnerable in our society. Chris will talk regularly about the latest developments in education law and also the up-to-date things that you might need to know.
So today we're looking at the mental health emergency that is developing across the United Kingdom. The lockdown has caused distress for probably everybody to a greater or lesser extent across the board. We're living in very strange and challenging times, but certain groups within the UK have been hit particularly hard. Today we are joined by some wonderful guests. We will be speaking to Julia Caro, an exceptionally brave mother, who some of you might have read about on Mike's Facebook page. And we're also going to be speaking to Suzan Issa, a SENCO who retrained as a therapist because she desperately wanted to help children in crisis.
We will also be joined live from Australia by Dr. Baburaj, a leading psychiatrist with expertise in people with learning disabilities.
There is really little doubt that individuals with an autism spectrum condition or intellectual disability are at an increased risk for experiencing a mental health crisis. The United States has really happened here in the UK. We've been living with this kind of crisis. I mean, despite terribly detrimental outcomes, hardly any research has systematically investigated the epidemiology of mental health crisis among those with autism. A clear understanding of the scope of the problem is, in my view, plainly necessary.
The term mental health crisis is analogous to a psychiatric emergency. And really that includes two things. Firstly, an acute psychiatric event that requires immediate intervention. And secondly, the lack of perceived resources to manage the event. And that's really what we're talking about today.
The prevalence of psychiatric and behavioural disorders in youth with autism is higher than in youth without autism. In community samples conducted in the United States, 70% of youth with autism were found to have at least one psychiatric disorder, a prevalence that is 3.5 times greater than in the general population. Other studies have suggested that between 95% and 74% of youth with autism exhibit 3 to 5 other disorders, respectively. Rates of the problem behaviours are also high, with 56% of youth directing aggression towards caregivers and 30% engaging in self-injury.
Suicide is a devastating consequence of mental illness. There has been little research focused specifically on people with autism who commit suicide. Research has found that the prevalence of lifetime experience of suicidal ideation in people diagnosed at a specialist adult clinic for autism was extremely high, and a whopping 66.2%. Plans or attempts to commit suicide were seen in 34% of the autism population. Adults with autism were significantly more likely to report lifetime experiences of suicidal ideation than individuals without autism. We must remember that those with autism who do entertain thoughts of suicide often show very few and obvious signs of their distress. Scientists are increasingly needing to identify these risks. Our first guest, Julia Caro, experienced what must be considered to be the worst nightmare for any parent. I mean, I wrote about her story on Facebook. Julia, thank you we all thank you so very much for joining us. And this is obviously a very difficult experience for you. You've been through what we would say is hell. I would really like to give you an opportunity to tell us your story about the wonderful Chris that I wrote about on on Facebook not so long ago, and I know it attracted quite a big response live on Facebook. So Julia, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for asking me to speak today. I know that a lot of us parents don't have access to any form of redress or any voice, and a lot of them look to you as a beacon. I know a lot of them will be watching and taking notes to try to fight their way through the system, and I was one of those. So we're so shocked. I am so shocked that to find myself, my family, our community, our nation in this situation, the mental health issues that our children had were bubbling, and then lockdown certainly has made it worse, but things were bad before, and now crisis just doesn't seem to be enough of a word to cover it. And as you said, there were no signs, absolutely none. He was described in the newspapers as a whiz kid. He had everything. So we, over the decades, my granddad was an NSPCC inspector, and my mum was a children's social worker. And we worked out between us over the decades what had caused my brother's death. We have autism in the family. It's quite genetic. I certainly think I'm sure I have traits, strong traits, if not a diagnosis if I ever bothered to get one. So we thought that we would never find ourselves in this situation with history repeating itself, because we knew, we've read the studies, we've read the articles, we knew what would happen if things weren't done properly. We were a happy-go-lucky family, beautiful childhoods the boys had. 3 autistic boys, including Chris. I have a 17-year-old and a 15-year-old as well. But what you can't legislate for as the parent of SEN or autistic children is, things happen in your perfect life that can throw you all overboard. And for us, it was bereavement. We lost my mum. She was ill with cancer, living with us for 2 years before she died. And there is little information for us parents. All of the Facebook pages and websites are very frilly. We can't talk about the negatives, but we need to, because we need to share knowledge and we need to shape our services using that knowledge. So Christopher seemed fine. He seemed to have dealt with the bereavement really well. And we spoke and we hugged and we did all of those things. We're no different to any other family. It's very hard to be understood when your children react differently. We all loved each other so much. One Monday morning, Chris left for school, and just like he did to get the school bus in any morning, about half an hour later, the phone rang. He was at the top of a multi-story car park. My son, he'd been saved by a security guard and taken to our GP. I rushed to the GP, collected him, and took him to A&E, where they rapidly assessed him, and made an appointment for what we call here UMS. We call it emotional well-being. I know nationally it's more often called CAMHS. And we had an appointment with them 2 weeks later for a psychiatric assessment and for a pathway to be created for him. We were taken by surprise. Nothing like this had ever happened. And in the 2-week period, waiting for the appointment, Christopher stopped eating, really, had a target weight of 1 pound. It's pretty unrealistic. And he started to cut his arms. All of these things were unknown to us. And we held on somehow. I don't think I slept at all for that 2 weeks, but I remember thinking, we have an appointment with, I'll call it CAMHS, and that will sort everything out. But I had known for a period of about 10 years before this, through other parents, that this was a problematic service. And so the problems have gone back a long way, and that our children were not really seemingly being treated. Or if they did access this service, it just wasn't fitting. So I remember a friend said to me, oh no, you're going to have to ring, you're going to have to go and see them. And I remember saying, yes, but actually things are so serious that I think it's going to be okay, because how could it not be? So on the day of the appointment, after 2 exhausting, terrifying nightmare weeks, we turned up at the office and they didn't know who we were. And it was very puzzling. And someone with a clipboard told us about CAMHS. And I remember sitting there thinking, I can't say anything in front of Chris. But how is CAMHS and the white wall going to cover this? Then we went home. I was really puzzled. And there was a message on the answer phone saying that the psychiatrist, they didn't have one. And that's why the appointment was being cancelled. So we'd just sort of seen a random woman at the office who didn't particularly know who we were. So I really panicked. They had lived up to their name, again, infamous, locally and nationally, from what I can see. So I went to my GP pleading, and my GP shrugged and went, well, what do you want me to do? And I said, well, maybe Great Ormond Street. Could you refer him there? Maybe they have something. And my GP did, to his credit, he made the referral, but we never heard anything again. We're sitting here waiting for that letter you get with your appointment. And for some reason, was it blocked? Was it sabotage? What happened? We never heard anything. So we took, my father took Christopher. My father was obviously recently widowed. He took Christopher to his home abroad with my uncle, who was also widowed. We'd had a triple bereavement, which of course was very hard for Christopher and my younger son. And also to New York, where his dad lived. And he came back weeks later, much stronger. And we got through the 4 years with Christopher. But then as lockdown, Christopher needed a lot of support, don't get me wrong. He went to college and he loved it, but he needed a lot of support. We knew he was fragile.
Julia,
Yes.
Julia, Chris was 19, was he not?
He was when he died, yeah. And as lockdown began, Christopher became more stressed because his routine of going out, he loved going out, being with people, was under threat. And he didn't know how to come to terms with that. That was hard. He had begun self-medicating with cannabis, which is not at all unusual with these young men who sit seemingly between the low functioning and high functioning brackets, but really the disability is the same in all of them. And that is when the problems began. He went missing and he was found at the top of a motorway bridge in Hackney, which is about 50 miles away from us. And he ended up being sectioned. It wasn't very easy to keep him in. But that period when he was 16 and inevitably going back to when he was sectioned, he ricocheted in and out of hospital. Community services and packages of care were non-existent to Shoddy. And the upshot of that was that despite my pleas for him to be kept safe, he jumped to his death. So it was attempt number 4 or 5 in a very short space of time. He jumped to his death. And it felt as if all of the opportunities to save him had been squandered. I still don't understand it, but I see it with other children. My youngest son became unwell sort of 4 years ago at the same time as Chris. He's very, very high functioning. He fell out of a top public school where he excelled. Again, I contacted CAMHS after Great Ormond Street had assessed him, and they simply refused to see him. So
what reason did they give you for refusing to see?
Oh yes, sorry. I rang the phone number again. Obviously I was in a state because I knew that they had completely failed Christopher. And there's a main telephone line, and they said, let me stop you there. We don't do autism. And I said, well, who does? I mean, the websites say they do. And they said, don't know, just not us. And I put the phone down and I just burst into tears because once again, I'm a single mum with 3 autistic boys. I have 1 or 2 ill and absolutely nowhere for them. So I contacted social services and I said, you have a duty to safeguard children, and my son can't access basic health care. And they said that they would pull strings, which they did. And someone came around 2 months later, it was either 2 or 3 months later, didn't seem to like me, wouldn't listen to me, wouldn't answer my questions, made some inappropriate comments. My son already had a 26-page report from 2 leads at Great Ormond Street, yet this man was in my sitting room saying, are you sure it's autism? It's not what I'm seeing. It didn't seem very professional at all and was very dismissive. And he left. And that was it, really. But I later got the notes from his visit, and it said, this child has anxious attachment. The mother agrees with me, and I'm referring to early help. Well, I certainly hadn't agreed with him. I was quite concerned at the way he spoke, and he didn't have a rapport with my son. My son was quite unwell, but he didn't seem to understand, and he didn't seem to be troubling himself to understand. So that was it. There was nothing for him. He wasn't leaving the house. He wasn't leaving his bedroom. I know that's quite a familiar thing nationally. So I made a complaint and I said, look, I have a report here. Great Ormond Street have asked you to make this young man a priority and get him back to school, give him therapy he needs or whatever.
And how old's your son?
He's 15 now. He was about 12. He was in year 7. So he had just transitioned to year 7, done brilliantly well, but just after mum died, just like Chris, he fell off his perch, as it were, and gradually stopped going to school, and they stop. The world becomes smaller and smaller, ever decreasing circles, and they need an intervention. They need therapy. The kind of therapy they need, the kind of therapist, the length of time, all of it are different and specialized to autism, like peculiar to autism. So those clinicians need to be there, and they weren't. Nobody seemed to be able to understand what we consider to be really basic mental health issues, relevant and pertinent to autism, that simply, in a very unfussy way, simply just needed an intervention from qualified staff. But this
Julia, have you been told that because your children have autism, they cannot access a service? Is that the point that you're...
That's what happened with my second son. With my first son, Chris, they phoned and left a message on the answer phone 2 weeks after a suicide attempt, as I said before, to say they didn't have a psychiatrist. What they seem to have down here is locums that seem to change every 6 months. 2 part-time locums that change seemingly every 6 months. So not only do you not have continuity, and they serve the entire community, there isn't really the time for those very limited clinicians in terms of both being part-time. They don't have the time needed either to see our children, even if they wanted to. One psychiatrist told me, because my youngest son was left for almost a year, I rang, I made like 20 calls a day. Please, will someone connect with my son? He was deteriorating. And you know, there'll be people out there saying, go private, go private. I did. There was a 5-month wait for a psychiatrist, because when your child is at home barricaded in their bedroom, you can't take that child to Harley Street. Harley Street has to come to you, and Harley Street's busy enough without needing to come to you. So waited 5 months for someone to be available. And so it was sort of, we'd gone from sort of January to September, and he was horrified and said, why haven't they followed the treatment plan from Great Ormond Street? Why have they done this? And we know from all the books that we read as parents that if you don't intervene early on, things will spiral. So I hired, well, CAMHS then swept in because things got serious, and tried to section my son. And what they said to me was, they swept in, it was quite scary really, from 0 miles an hour straight to 100 miles an hour. And they said, what we do with these is we section them. And I said, what do you mean? Yeah, we section them. And I said, well, you can't just do that. You have to try to treat them at home first. That's what the law says. You don't just go straight to a section with children like this. So again, loads of safeguarding, because I wouldn't play ball. And the upshot of it was I got a private treatment team in. And for the past 18 months, I've been paying for that for my son. Still am.
So, Julia, sorry, just for people's benefit, you tragically lost your beautiful son, Chris, at the age of 19. And you're saying that you have a 15-year-old son now who is in desperate need for support, and you're struggling to get services. I think that's what you're saying.
Disability social care, by law, from what I can see, we're entitled to that connection. I've been fighting for that for 2.5 years. I've had help from 2 national charities and a professor. I know that the Disability Law Service has written to 41 LAs, including ours, saying that children with high functioning autism, who can still, as you all know, still be very seriously disabled, and by law should be accessing disability social care. They are excluded in writing down here from that service. So children going through this not only are not able to access CAMHS, they are not able to access social care, and there doesn't seem to be a health pathway for them in any sense.
Your point that, again, there's no joined up planning and service. Julia, thank you for your account. It must be very difficult for you, and I understand that. And on behalf of everyone with me today, I know we all share your terrible pain, and we're very, very deeply sorry. Please stay online, because I want to bring in Suzan Issa, who is formerly a special needs coordinator, having worked in the school system for a long period of time, and now trained therapist. Sue, hi. Is this experience, sadly, is something that prompted you into the therapy side of things?
Yeah, I'd like to reiterate what Michael said. I'm so sorry for your experience, Julia. I really wish I could sit here and say that it's rare. And it's exactly those kinds of experiences and that trajectory that I try to avoid so much when I was within schools. And I remember having conversations with people saying we're at a pivotal point of this child's life. The next 6 to 12 months is absolutely crucial to work out where they're going to go beyond that. And the thing is, when you do have children who seem high functioning, as people like to call them, they're a problem only to themselves and their families and their own mental health, because they cover up so well. It doesn't seem to be a priority. And for as long as they're able to cover up all day at school, they don't seem to be a priority. And the biggest issue I had as a SENCO, the first thing was, who do you refer to? And it would be, you'd go to local authority and they say, no, only CAMHS deal with autism. You'd go to CAMHS and say, no, it's the child development team in the local authority. And then the child development back to CAMHS, who sent to a GP. And this is as a professional who's gone on each local authority's training on the referral pathway. And we're told very clearly, autism, you refer to CAMHS. But then CAMHS say they'll have nothing to do with autism, let alone any of the subcategories like PDA or any of the other things that can come along, and all the other subcategories. And then even there was 2 problems here. First of all, even if they accepted a referral, the shortest waiting list I ever had in my 10, 15 years was 18 months. I have a child now who I'm still in contact with. They've been on the waiting list for 4.5 years for assessment. We talk a lot about early intervention, how essential it is. Every minute in a child's life is like a month in an adult's life, and we have to get in early. But so you've got your first barrier of the waiting lists. Then after that, they get through the door, and I've had people who've had their first assessment just abandoned as soon as they mentioned pathological demand avoidance or autism or private reports. And I've also numerous amounts, they get to the meeting and then they are cancelled. And even that, the huge indication of the lack of understanding of the impact of getting a young person into an appointment, whether it be at home or in an office. You've got this young person with autism who's got everything that goes with that, and you're cancelling them last minute. So you've got that at your first barrier. And then even once they get into the system, you get this really arbitrary criteria for denial of support. And I mean, I sat down this weekend and tried to think of all the reasons that have most occurred. So I've had young children don't have mental health issues. They're too young for support and anxiety support. And this was for a 7-year-old who was displaying really, really quite awful self-esteem and self-harming tendencies. I've had them refused on accounts of autism, PDA. The parent hasn't had enough training, so it must be a parental issue. I've had them refused because they're already seeing another therapist. I've had them refused because a child is not engaging. And the other one I've had is, well, their grades are fine, it's not affecting them academically. And when they say they don't deal with autism, the thing I get told most is, well, it's not anxiety, it's just autism. They've got autism, and that's what you expect, off you go. And just trying, it felt like banging your head against a brick wall, because I would say to them, look, while we're waiting, the issues we're seeing a deterioration of self-esteem, we're seeing a rise of self-harm, we're seeing children with depression and anxiety. These don't have to be the outcome for children with autism. Depression and anxiety doesn't actually have to go hand in hand.
Susan, is that one of
when
the
we put them through these experiences?
Susan, was that the reason why you
Sorry.
retrained as a therapist, to try and help more people access?
Yeah, I always felt like I was
having some technical issues, I think, with your
interview. Sorry,
interview.
the sound's gone.
Might be an idea to bring in Dr. Baburaj. Dr. Raghu Baburaj, can people who have autism suffer depression?
I mean, as you stated with evidence at the start of the lecture, I mean, the prevalence of mental illness is quite high in autism. I mean, depression, you're looking at 30% or even more depression. And if you bring anxiety into the picture, you're almost looking at 50% of people with autism will suffer some form of anxiety. I mean, I would say the prevalence is even more.
Really? Did you find that you practiced as a consultant psychiatrist with expertise in helping those with learning disabilities? Did you find that there was a tendency to regard depression in cases of autism as not an area of priority?
I mean, there's this diagnostic overshadowing, isn't it? It's a polite word or a clinical word to attribute everything to the autism. I mean, the person is behaving like that because they've got autism. The person is behaving like this because they've got autism. I mean, physical causes can lead to behavior, constipation, like even mental distress, even if they're upset about something. There's a whole range of factors why people get behaviorally disturbed. But the attribution is to, it's got autism or the person has got learning disability, that's the way they behave. I mean, unfortunately, that is still very prevalent in society.
Are you aware that CAMHS are applying that same kind of approach, not just in the adult services, but in cases of children?
See, I worked in adult learning disability services in the UK. I hadn't worked in Wales, particularly in CAMHS services.
No.
However, if I can just say a couple of things before this. My heart goes to you, Julia. I mean, it was quite heartbreaking to listen to your account. And the other thing is, I want to talk about you, Mike. What got me involved in this is your passion. I mean, you were so passionate. I just thought I should take the cases that you are offering. Because to be honest, I mean, honestly, because, you know, I can safely say this, financially, it's not great, but just your passion just made me work for you, and that is great. I have to say these two things. Okay.
Well, that's so kind of you, Raghu, to say, and we're missing you in Wales and in the UK. We want you to come back from Australia.
I'll try. So, I mean, services for children with IED, with intellectual disability and autism is not well developed all over the country. I mean, the Welsh government is trying to plug the gaps by offering some amount of money to a consultant and some behavior therapists who see only the children who are in the homes, who are children who are most severely autistic and disabled. But there's no service for children with autism who are living with their parents. Because quite often, if they go to a CAMHS service, they would say it's almost an exclusion criteria. It's quite sad to see that, because some of the referrals that I saw for you were people from London, Birmingham, Manchester, and all they needed, I've just written some points, all they needed was some early intervention in the form of behavior management, joined up approach with education and CAMHS, sitting together, seeing how they can support this young person. And even legally, there was a failing because you have to make a reasonable adjustment. And I know the Mental Capacity Act doesn't apply to children, but still, you've got the duty. And early intervention would have been enough, would have prevented this family coming all the way to Wales, staying overnight in a hotel, spending their money with a behaviorally disturbed person, and seeing somebody so unfamiliar like me the next day. Very difficult to develop a rapport in just one meeting with somebody with autism. Quite often, a couple of people left the clinic and then we had to coax them to come back. And they became very anxious in clinic because it's quite understandable. So you had to do an assessment in such circumstances and prepare a report. So it was quite, heartbreaking to see some of these families who are going out of the way to do this for their children. So there is a deficit, there is a lack.
What Susan was saying was that the other added frustration is that they go through all this to get to someone like yourself to give a view, a series of recommendations, only to be told by the service providers that they will not accept a private report. I mean, you worked in the NHS as well as in the private sector. So have you had an experience of that, where your recommendations in the context of being a private expert is very different to the recommendations that you give when you are an NHS consultant?
It's difficult to say that because the only private reports I did were for adults with intellectual disability. And the only reports I did for children were exclusively with yourself.
Yeah.
And the court reports that I did were for adults who had committed, crime and offenses. But that the judge decides whether the report is kind of to be used or not.
Yeah.
But quite often you will find that, because I know I shouldn't say this, but it's easy to just say that, you've gone to Wales and got some report from a random guy. I mean, it does happen. And it happened with one of our cases, a medical person, if you remember.
Yes, I do.
Dispute about diagnosis with autism because they didn't
question whether you were able to give the recommendation. I remember it. Yeah. I mean, we sorted that one out, mind, of course.
I know, he did well. I mean, he's passed medical school. Great.
I mean, do you find that the one point that Julia and both Julia and Susan have said is that the idea that someone with autism, before you provide services to someone with autism who might be exhibiting signs of depression or anxiety, you have to unpick what constitutes the autism and what constitutes the depression. I mean, I found that intriguing, and there was a letter I received not long ago, actually, on behalf of a family, where they said, look, we can't give you services because all these features of the anxiety and depression that you're reporting, it's part and parcel of your autism. And what do you make of that? Because I mean, I can see no reference, unless I'm wrong, in the ICD classification of diseases or in the DSM criteria for depression or anxiety ever forming a part of that diagnostic criteria.
I mean, people with autism at the end of the day are human beings, they're people. So they can have all the mental illnesses that people can have. So even morally, I can't see how you can justify a statement like that is just the autism and that is just learning disability. I mean, you just can't. I suppose it's an easy way of excluding somebody from services. I mean, that's what I'm trying to think in my mind.
Charlotte, you've been quite quiet, sitting there listening. Have you got any particular thoughts about how the law should approach this, given that there does seem to be a practice of recommending to parents really no particular service when you've got autism?
Well, it's interesting. What I've been thinking about, and as you know, Mike, I do work for parents, and I also do work for local authorities, and I also do work for CCGs. So I should probably declare that I do work for a wide range of different organisations in this area. One of the disputes that I see a lot in the first tier tribunal, and I'm sure you do too, is where you have a dispute over wording in an EHC plan, because everybody agrees the young person has something like anxiety. You also see it with things like language disorders. But if that person has autism, there is often a bit of a dispute about whether they have anxiety in line with their autism, or whether they have some different sort of anxiety that's over and above their autism, maybe a generalized anxiety disorder or something like that. And I think that where that distinction comes from, and I'd be really interested to know what Dr. Baburaj thinks about this, I think where that distinction comes from is that we do sometimes see children and young people who are struggling in a particular environment. So perhaps they have very pronounced sensory issues and they're in a mainstream school with 1,000 pupils, and that mainstream school is never going to be a low arousal place. It's never going to be a calm atmosphere. They cannot make the adjustments that that young person or child needs. And with some of those children and young people, you can say, well, if this person was in a different environment, if they were to go to an ASD-specific special school, you would see a lot of these anxieties disappear just because the environment is better for them. And I think that what is happening, I don't know, because I'm not going to pretend to be a psychiatric expert or understand how CAMHS decide, or any sort of mental health provider decides what its criteria for treatment is. But I think that what sometimes happens is that there is a confusion between a young person who has anxiety just because they need to be somewhere that's a bit quieter so that they can focus to learn, or has that ASD specialism. But if you have that, then their anxiety will reduce considerably without any need for specialist intervention like talk therapy or counselling or something like that. And then you have another category of young people, and I think, Julia, your story is so sad and so terrifying to all of us as parents. I don't have any words to express how I feel about it, except to say that I am so terribly sorry. There is another set of children and young people who are suffering very marked mental distress that is not going to be solved just by moving them to a different environment. And I think, I don't know, as I say, I'd like to know what Dr. Baburaj thinks about that. It sounds to me as though what's really happening is that the default option is let's try another environment, or let's try some strategies and see if that helps. And then if it doesn't help, we'll look at if there's whether there's a more targeted psychiatric approach. Now, in terms of where the law can intervene, as you know, Mike, it's difficult because expert evidence is kind of outside the law almost, in the sense that it's evidence like everything else. You put it before a local authority or a tribunal or a CCG or whoever you're asking to make a decision, and they take that into account along with the, whatever other evidence in the case there is. So at the moment, I don't think there's an obvious legal mechanism for, I'm not sure what the obvious legal mechanism for changing this is. And I'd be interested to know what you think, Mike, because obviously you have a huge amount of experience in this area.
Well, I mean, before I come on to that, I think you raised a very interesting point about unpicking the kind of things that might be the source of the anxiety, and trying to take those things away before you then decide what is you're left with, the core issue the medical condition that you're left with. A lot of young people with autism or intellectual disability might find the environment too stimulating. That might be anxiety provoking. There may be peer pressure, it's difficult communicating and so on. Dr. Baburaj, I mean, that's common, isn't it? I mean, when do you actually cross the threshold where you think that, here is someone who is in this situation, who needs intervention, clinical intervention, whether it be talking therapy or whether it be support in the kind of medication? When do you determine that you've got past that sort of that threshold?
See, what I'd like to do is not to treat autistic people differently. Okay. See, all of us have faced bereavements in life. We've faced stress, and we are all vulnerable to developing mental illness when we are placed in extreme stress. So I suppose the same rule applies to somebody with autism, even to a greater extent. So if somebody with autism is placed in a highly inappropriate environment where there's a lot of noise and bullying and stuff, the effect of this stress can potentially lead to the development of a mental illness, which can be like a single depressive episode. And sometimes we find that people who develop one depressive episode go on to develop multiple episodes. It's just called neuronal kindling. I mean, the nerve cells get fired to an extent that it develops a depressive disorder. So it's very hard to say. But the rule of thumb is if it affects quality of life, it's a mental illness. If you need to go and see somebody because your quality of life is so disturbed, it's a mental illness. So extrapolating it to the general population, somebody has bereavement, in a week, they're able to compartmentalize that and get back to work. You wouldn't call it depression. Whereas another person who has faced kind of similar bereavement has stopped eating and drinking and is in a depressed state, not able to work, you would call that depression and you would treat them. So I think the same rule applies for somebody with autism.
Have you found there's been any difference in approach between what you've experienced in the United Kingdom versus what you're experiencing now in Australia? Do they have a similar approach to managing the needs of those with intellectual disability and autism? I mean, unpicking, if you like, those kind of diagnostic criteria and trying to work out what is part of the autism, what's part of the intellectual disability. Is that the same approach that's happening in Australia?
I'm completely working in adult psychiatry now, at general adult psychiatry, like schizophrenia and depression.
Yeah.
And I had no contact with anybody with intellectual disability or CAMHS because it goes to a completely different stream.
I see.
And Australia is slightly different because you've got private and public kind of hand in hand.
I see.
People can go and see a private doctor if they don't want to come and see you. So it's a different system.
Well, you see, I mean, to answer Charlotte's point, Charlotte raised a very interesting point about, what do I see that perhaps the law could do? I mean, I find it deeply repugnant that a person with autism or intellectual disability are denied services because they are somehow treated as if they're in some kind of different category and not the human being that they actually are, as Dr. Baburaj has said. And I think if the criteria of trying to determine whether someone has a depressive illness and then determining that they should not have services because they also have the diagnosis, that's something I think is open to challenge. It doesn't seem rational to me. It's not rational because if it was part of the autism, you would expect the diagnostic criteria to have regard to depression, anxiety being part of the autism. And it isn't. It simply isn't. So where are they inventing this idea? Chris, I'd be interested to see what you think about that. I mean, where do you think how are they inventing this idea of somehow thinking that someone with autism or intellectual disability, and if they have depression, somehow they don't require services?
Well, I think that, listening to everyone speaking, it's difficult to pinpoint exactly where that mistake is happening, but it very much is happening. And I think that's what we do recognize, as Dr. Baburaj said, that clinical overshadowing of, what is autism, what is not autism. And Charlotte correctly pointed out that this doesn't just happen in mental health difficulties. I have seen it in mental health difficulties or a position of an opponent saying it's a part of their autism, but also with speech and language difficulties too, saying that, autism affects the social communication, ergo their social communication presentation is normal within their autistic spectrum diagnosis. Now, I think what we hear, and I think there's a lot of truth in certainly, and Charlotte's giving us a useful perspective, not just obviously as she is a claimant representative, but also a wider experience representing on occasion local authorities and CCGs, that sometimes it's this perception that maybe, for example, the CCG, the health group, the care commissioning group, doesn't actually think it's a health issue. They think perhaps it's more an educational issue. The child's in the wrong educational environment. That is creating the overwhelming sensations and overstimulating the child. That is creating meltdown, that is creating anxiety and distress, and that is what's being presented as a mental health difficulty. So they're thinking, actually, you know, what we would do here, even with talk therapy, probably isn't going to solve the source of the problem. And I think we saw that perhaps with Julia's story as well. Obviously very, very tragic, not just with poor Chris, who very tragically took his life at a very young age this year, but also her youngest son as well, also then being denied services. I think that the elephant in the room, as it often is in public sector cases, is resources, and it's also cooperation between various departments. You know, what we saw in Julia's case was her being passed from pillar to post. You know, we saw her going to the GP, perhaps the GP not being able to assist, or then flagging it onto CAMHS. CAMHS then saying, oh, it's autism. No, that has to go to a different department or a different scheme. And what you're not having, and I think really what we're perhaps seeing is what's really required is that multidisciplinary approach. So you have that kind of CAMHS and health focused specialism, ideally with autism specialism as well, some training in the presentation of those with autism spectrum disorder, which I do think is thin on the ground. But then alongside that, you have the social care, and alongside that, you have the educational support, because it's only in that kind of multidisciplinary environment can you really start to think, okay, you know, is this caused by bereavement? You know, if it's caused by bereavement, then as Dr. Baburaj said, you know, it may very well be a mental health difficulty, because it isn't necessarily a social kind of prompt that's causing this, or an educational kind of trigger. It is something different, something more related to health or the personal circumstances. And perhaps then in those circumstances, health is the right environment to support. Other times, as Charlotte said, it may be actually that although the child is presenting with this terrible anxiety, the source of that anxiety is their school. And then perhaps it's the realm of education. Say, okay, let's now take them out of that environment into a better environment. But the problem is when you don't have these departments speaking to one another, when perhaps they don't necessarily have the training or the specialism in those with autism, you can often see them either, you know, trying to pass the buck, as it were, thinking, oh, no, this isn't for us, this is for someone else. Perhaps altruistically, perhaps thinking, you know what, this isn't really, we're not the right people for this. But also it could be that they feel that they don't either have the capacity or the resources to deal with it, and they're just trying to push it off their docket. And I think that's really the issue that we're seeing practically, is, you know, when all departments are struggling with resources and perhaps struggling with training, you know, you do get these pillar to post type decisions, and it doesn't really help the child ever, because no one takes authority for the decision, and no one really makes the decision. And that's what we saw with Julia. You know, yes, they did eventually section, and of course that is a power that they have, you know, and can be dealt with before the mental health tribunal as well. But of course, you know, sometimes when you're dealing with someone who's already attempted suicide, you know, from what we know, from what Dr. Baburaj said and other experts in the field, that's somewhat closing the stable door after the horse has bolted. You know, early intervention is really critical. And I think that's where presently there's a lot of weakness and a lot more funding and support needed. Thanks, Chris.
Julia, when Chris made that first attempt in the car park, just remind me, I think you turned to the mental health services for help at that point. Did they actually, what service did they offer?
Some woman with a clipboard told us about Keith and the White Wall. That was it. And they never contacted us again. I mean, we came home, we found the answer phone message saying, you have no appointment today because we don't have a psychiatrist. We never heard from them again. And I went to our GP. But what interested me, Michael, was what you've been saying for the last few minutes. Bullying. Our children are very vulnerable, but they're quite resilient. But they can endure years of bullying, as Dr. Baburaj said, and it is very toxic. And then metaphorically walking on broken legs, they suffer so much, they don't tell us. When they need help, when we know they need it so badly. We see young children now exhibiting serious mental illness at the age of 4 or 6. Jason Barnett, with his Voice for the Fatherless, a brilliant group which focuses on suicides as the result of bullying, also encompasses our autistic children. Melanie Leahy's campaign for justice for her son Matthew, which we have joined with 26 other families of dead young people. And what's interesting is that I'm finding a very high number of those dead young people, young adults from our local services, have diagnoses of autism or are unassessed, but have autistic nephews, for example. This is where our children are ending up, in adult mental health services, which again are not commissioned to meet their needs. Christopher had an IQ of 58 and he had epilepsy, autism, as you know. And he was denied access to the autism, epilepsy and LD team. He wasn't properly assessed. He wasn't assessed for suicide risk. You name it, nothing relevant was done. He too was denied access to learning disability, autism, social care. They kept, what we're finding is we have parents who are being safeguarded repeatedly when they ask and demand for services. We have a lot of parents who nobody ever sees or hears from because they're too terrified of being safeguarded when they ask for services. We think things are deliberately being misunderstood in order to get shot of all of them, but the problems don't go away. These young people die. They're dying before the age of 50 in high numbers, and it's our fault. We have we don't have much access to justice, but people are joining together nationally, and we need them very, very badly to speak for those children who can't speak. Everybody needs to stand up. I know that when Christopher died, hundreds of people came to our local park just to stand up, and they made music just to let everybody know we care. We can't get our government to act, and at grassroots level, we see failure, and I would call it strategic incompetence, because it's too many closed doors. Every door closed, everybody has realized they can shrug these children off, and they are dying. So I started a support group with Maggie Cleary locally. We have 615 families. We are hearing these stories every day. Our children need help. Our children need everybody to stand up now for them. It's a scandal.
Julia, as I say, it is. I mean, it's terribly distressing to hear that some people are living in fear of reporting to the local authorities their fear about the health of their children, only to be accused of fabricating a condition. I mean, this is a real live serious issue that I think
very common, Michael, and they are terrified.
Sue, I know that you had some technical issues earlier, but is that, if you're still there, that is?
Yes, I'm still here. Yep.
Did you find that this was common in the school system when you were operating there?
Absolutely. And the thing is, when you don't provide an entire family with support, that entire family breaks down, and that creates a very, very volatile home environment, and people that have been denied support. And the other issue with CAMHS stand in the way of other support because they're not accepting these private reports. They say they want more information in order to assess and support, but then they won't take on the private reports. And so they're holding up all kinds of support by not accepting that. 5 years down the line, you've got a child who's refusing school, parents I end up saying to parents, look, I can see this happening. Your child may start refusing school. I want you to call attendance now to say their needs are not being met. It's becoming more difficult to get them into school, preempt everything. And 5 years down the line, they're finding themselves, oh, you're not safeguarding your other children because your child with anxiety and autism, his behavior is so volatile and dangerous and aggressive. We're now going to investigate your other children. This isn't rare. It's so common. And then
I think Sue, we're having some problems
again. Get the parents saying out, and they're trapped. They're trapped in. Sorry.
I think we've had some technical problems, but I think we got the message. I mean,
Am I back?
You're You're coming and going, I think.
Oh, I do apologise. I have tried all sorts of things here. I'm not sure what's happening.
Well, Charlotte, hearing Julia's story, I'm sure you, like I, it's just heartbreaking to hear that. What a terrible end. But there are things that parents can still do. I mean, there's no need to feel that there's nothing that can be done. I mean, one thing for sure, Charlotte, I'm sure you'll agree with me, is that we could, in a case like that, if you have an education plan, for example, to call an emergency annual review to get health and to get social care to come in and support, because there are packages of support and care that can be done, and statutory obligations that exist on local authorities to take proactive steps to help people who are in need, particularly those who have a plan.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, we really need to start by looking at it a few steps before where Julia and her son so tragically ended up. So the first thing that we might do is talk in principle about what parents can do. And as you've said, the first thing is, if you're talking about a child or young person who's still in some sort of education, maybe they're at school, maybe they're at college, whether that's mainstream or special, maybe they're at an institution that isn't a school or a college, but which is still providing them with education, they've got a plan. So if they have an EHC plan, as you say, you can call an annual review and you can say to the local authority, this is a young person or child who is in crisis or is obviously heading towards a crisis. You, local authority, you need to talk to us about what we can put in place for this child or young person. If the child or young person doesn't have an EHC plan and they're under 26, then of course you can also look at getting them an EHC plan. That's not a quick process, as we know, right, Mike? I mean, that can be a long and difficult process. But that is a possibility as well, to try and get them the EHC plan. And that can give both, it starts an assessment process, it can get parents and young person stroke child just feeling like there is a framework around them, there's something that can be done, and that might help.
One of the things, of course, that Julia was mentioning was the sort of automatic rejection of support because you have autism. I mean, my feeling on that is, as you know, I'm very uncomfortable with that. I mean, do you agree with me in relation to this? Yeah,
I think it can be. I think it could. There's a sort of complicating factor, which is that no two children or young people are alike, and that's particularly the case with children and young people who are not developing neurotypically. And the difficulty, I think, is that there is a valid point to be made about when you have a young person or a child who has not had a diagnosis of autism, perhaps, or they've had a diagnosis of autism, but they are just in completely the wrong setting. They're in a mainstream busy setting and they need to be in a quiet setting. In many of those children and young people, as we know, just going to the right setting can help with their anxiety if their anxiety arises from that situation of being in the wrong place. And I think the problem is that there can be a sort of default setting of, let's try strategies, let's try an EHC plan, let's try the right setting, if you like, first. And for many children and young people, that will work. But the difficulty is that we are seeing some children and young people who that won't work for, who need really acute provision. And the question is, what do you do for those children for whom that approach won't work, when it feels as though you've got everybody just saying, that's it, come back to us when that hasn't worked?
And of course, it could be too late. So
that's always the fear.
I mean, well, but there are things that can be done. I mean, we talked about the education healthcare plan and the regime and the protection that's around young people in those circumstances. I mean, annual reviews is a great place to try and report concerns about what's going on, calling emergency meetings, making sure you record what your concerns are, both with the health service, both with social services and with education. I mean, I think that we have to recognize that in the case of children, and I know we talked about in Chris's case, he was 19, he wasn't exactly a child, but in the case of children, you have the Children Act and the legislation that surrounds that, the obligation to cooperate with other agencies and services, so that asking social services for help can be one proactive step that you can and they have a proactive duty. They should be proactively involved. They should undertake some kind of assessment. Getting health across the table with social services too is something that can be done, because there's a duty of cooperation.
Yeah.
Must also, Charlotte, mustn't it, apply when it comes to a very vulnerable adult? The same sort of protection exists.
Yeah, there are specific duties under the Care Act to young people who are over 18. So, yeah.
Well, there we are. I mean, I say in many cases, and we've said it before, endlessly, really, that recording your concerns, being proactive and asking different statutory agencies for support, writing down your requests, recording what people have said to you, that kind of thing. You can build a picture, can't you? Which can be helpful. It's not all doom and gloom. There is an opportunity out there to get some support, and there's a lot of people who can help you. I mean, there's other support agencies that are out there to help in times of crisis, and of course you can always contact any one of us at the edge of the magazine to help you. I mean, we're always there to assist.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing that it's interesting to pick up on in what Julia was saying is she was talking about the difficulties of getting a private report looked at. So we know that some parents and young people struggle to get an appointment with CAMHS or with another mental health provider, you know, that isn't a private or an independent health provider. They struggle to get an appointment quickly enough to meet the needs that they feel they have. And in those circumstances, obviously there's good old fashioned going to the GP and pressing the GP. In the hope that the GP will use their influence to try and get an appointment through quicker. There's also the private route, not affordable for everybody, but there is no law. It's really important to know your child doesn't have to go to CAMHS in the first instance. Your child, you can seek a private referral if you're worried that your child's needs are very, very acute and that the CAMHS appointment isn't going to come quickly enough. Now, what we've heard from some parents is that when they get those private reports, they struggle really to get the local authority or CAMHS to really look at those, because independent consultants can work to a very different sort of way of working. They can adopt slightly different criteria because they're not looking at a mode of practice for all the children in the area. And I think the message that we probably want to send to those parents, tell me if you think I'm wrong, is, well, those reports are valid and will be looked at. So if you end up needing, for example, to go to court or to go to the Special Educational Needs Tribunal to get the provision that your child needs, those reports will not be irrelevant. They will be important evidence about your child's state.
We value all of the contributions that are being made today in what's been quite a harrowing episode, the first episode of the Education magazine. I'd like to certainly thank all of our guests who've come and taken their time today to assist us. I mean, interestingly, I've done a little bit of research when just before this broadcast to look at what other local authorities have put down in their local offer under Section 30 of the Children and Families Act. It's interesting because in the local offer that a local authority must publish, which is, of course, it's a document that must be published in cooperation with its other partner agencies, including health authorities, including the social services departments and schools. The provision, they must identify provision for children and young people to include education, healthcare, and social care provision. And interestingly, in all of the local offers that I've been reading online, all of those lists of provisions that they say that they should provide for, if you like, includes mental health services for children in real crisis, even though the whole purpose of the Children and Families Act is to try and support people with special educational needs and people with learning disabilities, and that will of course include autism and intellectual disability. So it's fascinating, really, that that you have on the one hand a local authority saying that we will provide this support to the outside world, but yet behind the scenes on the ground, it's not actually being delivered. I mean, it's shocking that Chris took the steps that he did. I said on Facebook that his ending of his life is just heartbreaking, and he should never have had to have done that. And there should have been much more services available to him. And there are so many children out there who are in need, not just children, adults who are in need. And in particular during this lockdown, we are forgetting, I think, just how serious a crisis that we are falling in. Young people who are people with autism who are being denied the opportunity to go out and to relate with others, which is part of their disability. And they're getting more and more distanced from the services that they so desperately need. And there's people, as Julia said, there are people out there who are dying. I think there's a time that we've come to that I think we must act. There must be something that must be done, and we support absolutely the campaign that Julia is launching. But I'd like to thank everyone for taking the time today, for joining. Thank you, Suzan. Thank you, Dr. Baburaj, and thank you, of course, Julia, for coming on today. And it has been obviously a very difficult episode. I hope you've enjoyed the Education Magazine's first edition, and of course the topic that we've been discussing. I know that there's going to be much more that we will be discussing in future episodes. I mean, one of the ones ahead will include bullying. We'll talk about lockdown. We'll be talking about the special needs tribunal system, where what's wrong with that, and we'll be looking at stories on Facebook and commenting on them and inviting you to join us. Chris, and we're going to be, as a regular feature, we're going to be talking about cases that have been happening in the last few months. And what are the big cases that have happened in the last few months that you want to tell everyone about?
Well, yes. So I've actually chosen one of ours. It was decided in 2019, but reported earlier this year in the Education Law Reports, which is why I've raised it for us today. And of course, Charlotte was also part of this case too. So I thought it was a good opportunity in our first magazine show to really talk about it. So the case is called Nottinghamshire County Council and SF and GD, and it was decided in 2019 in the Upper Tribunal. We will send a link to the judgment in the show notes that will be published online. So it was essentially an appeal by a local authority against the decision of the first tier tribunal that it was necessary for provision to be made for a young person through an EHCP in accordance with section 37(1) of the Children and Families Act. That's the section which decides the threshold for providing an education healthcare plan. The local authority felt that the tribunal had erred in its interpretation of this section and that an EHCP was not necessary in its eyes. Its main argument was that in this case, the first tier tribunal had focused on the comparative for special educational provision being that generally available to pupils in England as a whole, rather than Nottinghamshire as an area. Nottinghamshire felt that was an error, and in particular pointed to their local offer and the support that they were providing the child, which they felt was not only comprehensive, but meeting the child's needs in full, thereby deciding that if the tribunal had looked at the local area and the particular efforts that Nottinghamshire had made, that it would not have made the decision it did make, which was to determine that the EHC plan was necessary. It argued that the interpretation was incorrect and put the question to the Upper Tribunal. And of course, the respondents in this case were the parents, and Charlotte and ourselves represented them. And essentially what we put forward was that there was a different approach advocated in the Children and Families Act to what is special educational provision in comparison with the Education Act 1996. So the Education Act 1996, as you know, Mike, as you're very, very familiar with, and of course still applies here in Wales. So for those in Wales, never experienced, Mike, never old, just experienced. So of course, you know, in the Education Act 1996, section 312(4)(a) defines special educational provision, and it reads essentially as follows. So it says that special educational provision means in relation to a child who's attained the age of 2, educational provision which is additional to or otherwise different from the educational provision made generally for children of his age in schools maintained by the local authority other than special schools. And in the Children and Families Act, that's under section 21, it reads slightly differently. It says special educational provision for a child aged 2 or more, or a young person, means educational or training provision that is additional to or different from that made generally for those of the same age in mainstream schools in England. So of course, this is where the local authority were coming from, perhaps themselves used to working under the old Act, only prior to 2014, so pretty recent, the change when in this grand scheme of things. And they were saying that, look, when we decide whether a plan is necessary, we can look at this in a number of ways, and the tribunal does look at this in a number of ways. It looks at this firstly in terms of, is it necessary in the strict sense of, without an EHC plan, would the funding be available for the provision needed by this child? So kind of in that quantitative assessment of, is there going to be enough provision to meet this child's needs with the funding available without an EHC plan? And then there is a slightly more interpretive element of certainty. So we can have that even if arguably the provision could be made without an EHC plan, is it nonetheless in the interest of the child and the interest of certainty that a plan is made to guarantee that that provision will be delivered? And the upper tribunal, having heard these arguments, sided with us. And of course, very helpful for this magazine show to talk about a case where we managed to convince the upper tribunal that we were right and the local authority were wrong, of course. No, they agreed that obviously when you look at the new wording of Section 21 of the Children and Families Act, where it does talk about that made generally for others of the same age in mainstream schools in England or in mainstream post-16 institutions in England, it was right for the tribunal in that case to compare that which was available with those wider than the local authority area and actually across all of England. The upper tribunal felt that as a specialist tribunal, the first tier tribunal was well placed to decide or at least understand what was usually available to those in other local authority areas, and that it was not in error to, as it were, cast this wider eye, irrespective of Nottinghamshire's particular efforts to make additional support in this case. So it was really good to have that clarified, I think, from the tribunal, because what we do find, and I'll come to Charlotte in a bit and we talk about some of the trickiness of this case in particular, but I'm sure, Mike, you'll be familiar that sometimes this is the hardest appeal to fight, is the question of when an EHC plan or a statement is necessary. Sometimes when we're dealing with assessment, that has a kind of lower threshold to hit, and when we're dealing with the contents of a plan, although there will be arguments about the contents, hopefully, and if it's been run properly, appeals run properly, normally the areas of dispute will be relatively narrow, although they could be very, very important nonetheless. But when it comes to necessity, it's very much a black and white style appeal. You're going to succeed and get the plan, or you're not going to succeed and not get the plan. And it can be quite a stark difference. So it was good here that the upper tribunal did clarify that for cases in England, the FTT is to cast that wider eye. And what that does mean for parents is quite useful, is that to some extent, even if your local authority is meeting need, if your local authority is perhaps going above and beyond the call of duty, which is very good, of course, you may even want to consider not going for an EHCP in those circumstances. But if you want that statutory protection, that may not necessarily prevent an EHC plan being provided, because if your local authority, as perhaps was the case with Nottinghamshire here, is going beyond that which is generally available, that doesn't necessarily mean that they can't have an EHC plan. So Charlotte, I mean, you obviously argued this case successfully. So what do you recall of this case, and what do you think the tricky parts were for you?
So it's an interesting case because it started out as an appeal by the local authority on the basis of the meaning of the word necessary in the Children and Families Act. And that was also the way that it was argued in the upper tribunal. In the course of appeal, I think in the end, the local authority agreed that actually there didn't need to be any particular gloss on the word necessary. What they had been arguing was, how can a plan be necessary in circumstances where the first tier tribunal has found, as it did in this case, that the child in question was making progress, that the school was putting in place a substantial package of provision that did in fact go beyond what could normally be expected across the country. In those circumstances, how, said the local authority, could a plan be necessary, because effectively needs were already being met within the plan. Factually, there was a question mark over whether what was in place would continue to be sufficient. And so there was a kind of interesting side issue about how far you look forward when you're a tribunal, because obviously a plan is good for a year. And so arguably, if you're the first tier tribunal saying does this child need a plan? You should also be looking, and in our experience, tribunals usually do look, don't they, at at whether that plan is likely to become necessary over the next 6 months to a year, because otherwise you're very aware as a first tier tribunal that you're leaving that child potentially without support if it turns out that actually they're going to need more support than they're currently getting. And in the end, actually, we didn't really argue those issues out, because as the Court of Appeal says in its judgment, the question really ended up not being about the meaning of the word necessary, and not being a dispute about what the standard is for necessary, because in fact the Children and Families Act does say the standard is compared with what would normally be available in England as opposed to within the specific area that your child is being educated in. What it really came down to was, had the first tier tribunal made a reasonable decision? And reasonable in this context means, was it a decision that could have been reached? So it's not about whether the Court of Appeal would have made the same decision or whether another tribunal would have made the same decision. It's about whether the decision was so totally off the wall, so completely out of whack with the evidence that was before it, that no tribunal could possibly have reasonably come to that conclusion. And the Court of Appeal found that other tribunals might have come to a different decision. And perhaps it was a case that was on the margins, in the sense that perhaps it was a case where another tribunal might have said a plan's not needed and it would have been difficult to oppose that. But effectively what the Court of Appeal did here was it said, this is the first instance court, as we say, this is the tribunal that actually heard the witnesses, actually read the documentation and actually thought about it from that perspective. It came to this decision, which on the face of it is a reasonable decision, and we, the Court of Appeal, can't really see any need to disturb it. But it was a really interesting case to argue, and it goes right to the heart of these appeals, really. You know, what is necessary, as you say, Chris? Where is that sort of that indefinable moment when a child passes from needs being met at school without an EHC plan to needs really needing to be met through an EHC plan? And you know, in some respects, I suppose many people might read this judgment and say, has it necessarily taken things any further? And the answer is that it has, because it's done something really important. It's confirmed that the question of necessary is a question for the tribunal that actually looks at the evidence. It's not over technical. It doesn't have any gloss on it. It doesn't have a special super restrictive meaning that makes it harder or easier to get an EHC plan. It's up to the tribunal, the specialist tribunal, looking at the evidence and making its decision. And that actually is a really important development.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. Mike, do you have any thoughts on the case?
Well, I think my big thought is that just as well as just comparing what's available in England rather than comparing what's available in Wales, because we might have a real dogfight.
Yes, absolutely right. Yes, that is very much, you know, obviously it's been a great confirmation, I suppose, for those in England. And as Charlotte said, you know, sometimes even when you get appellate courts, and certainly the Court of Appeal as one of the most senior appellate courts in the country, you know, confirming the obvious in some ways. You know, you think that the statute says in England, does it mean in England? And the answer is yes. But that clarification is always very important. I suppose in Wales we are dealing with still the local area issue under the Education Act 1996, and it does mean that your particular circumstances come into the fold. In some ways that can actually be helpful, because of course if you live in perhaps a more remote area of Wales, in a more remote county, you know, your county may not have the same resources available as, let's say, Cardiff, for example, you know, being a more populous location with more schools involved. So in some ways that more local focus can assist you. Obviously at other times perhaps it cannot, because you know your individual circumstances may be very different than that generally available. And of course most of the time people are pushing for, in Wales obviously, statements or in England education healthcare plans, is because they really want to have that certainty of provision, that safeguarding of provision. Because of course, as we all know, if you don't provide provision that's set out within a statement or a plan, that is enforceable through the High Court, through judicial review. So, you know, if it's not given, you have a mechanism to get it provided. Whereas of course, without the statement in the education healthcare plan, although some rights do exist, it's wrong to say that no rights exist. They are of course much more general and much more harder to enforce. So I think good clarification from the court there, and nice to see a case from us in the education reports as well.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thanks, Charlotte, and thank you for watching this, our first education magazine broadcast. And as I said earlier, we really want to get on with campaigning, debating, arguing topical points, and I want to hear from you. Please keep sending your messages to me and tell me your stories, because it gives me an idea of the kind of things we want to put on this on this broadcast for future editions. I mean, for me, I'm going to be off now writing to Public Health England and asking them what about commissioning services for young people with autism and supporting them when they are depressed. So we're going to be on that, and we'll report back later in another broadcast about what we might find about that. But and in future broadcasts, as I say, I think we're going to be talking about bullying. We'll be talking about universities, difficulties with getting disabled students allowance or getting support from universities. We'll be talking about the kind of episodes and that students have to go through, some of the injustice that occurs there, the Office of the Independent Adjudicator. All of these things we'll be talking about in future episodes. And it's been a pleasure to have you with us today, and thank you for joining us, and thank you again to all of our guests today. And we will be reporting back later, and we'll probably have our guests back on too. We want to hear again on how Julia gets on with her campaign and how Sue is getting on, and we want to hear again from Dr. Baburaj about all the wonderful work that he's been doing. And thanks again to Charlotte and to Chris. Thank you all very much for joining us, and come back next time.